All right, today we're going to unpack something huge, literally. It's the monumental story of India's population. This is a journey through time, so let's get right into it. Okay, to really wrap your head around the scale here, just look at this. You've got 17.5% of every single person on Earth living in India. Now get this. They're all packed onto just 2.4% of the world's land. I mean, think about that for a second. The density is just staggering. So that brings up the big question, right? How on earth does one single country become home to almost a fifth of all humanity? What happened? What were the forces at play here? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down. First things first, let's start with the basics. The hard numbers, just to set the stage for everything that follows. So if we look at the last official count we have, the 2011 census, the population was a whopping 121.02 crores. For those not familiar, a crore is 10 million, so we're talking about over 1.2 billion people. Back then, that put India at number 2 in the world, right behind China, and we get this incredible data from a massive census they do every 10 years. Now, when you think about India's population, you probably imagine it's just been growing and growing for the last 100 years, right? A straight line up. But there's a fascinating twist. Our story really kicks off at this one very strange moment in time when that wasn't the case at all. Just look at this timeline. Between 1911 and 1921, something completely unexpected happened. The population, it actually went down. It went from 25.2 crores to 25.1 crores. It might not seem like a huge drop, but it's the only time in modern Indian history this has ever happened. The growth didn't just stop, it literally reversed. This wasn't just a small blip on the radar. It was so important, so significant that the Census Commissioner of India gave it an official name, the Year of Great Divide. And it's the perfect name because it's like a massive wall in time, separating what came before from everything that came after. So what happened? Why the dip? Well, it was tragic, really. The country was just hammered by a wave of terrible epidemics. We're talking influenza, cholera, plague, malaria. They were rampant. It led to a tragically high death rate, so high that it actually overtook the number of births for that decade. But after 1921, after that Great Divide, the entire story just flips on its head. The population didn't just bounce back, oh no. It started to grow at a speed that nobody had ever seen before. And this image, this says it all, doesn't it? On the left, you see a scene from 1961. Then on the right, 50 years later, in 2011. It's just an incredible visual for what demographers call the population explosion. Let's just run through the numbers, and you'll see how fast this happened. Okay, 1951, right after independence. The population is at 36.1 crore. Fast forward just 20 years to 1971, and boom, we're already at 54.8 crore. You can just feel the acceleration, right? And then, by 2001, India hits this unbelievable milestone, 1 billion people, 102.7 crore. That's nearly a threefold increase in just half a century. That is the population explosion. So the question is, why? How did this happen? Okay, so to really get the why behind this explosion, we need to talk about a really cool concept that explains how this stuff works. It's called the theory of demographic transition, and it's key to understanding this whole story. First up, we have the birth rate, or fertility rate. Super simple concept. It's just the number of live births for every 1,000 people in a year. And on the other side of the coin, you've got the death rate, also called the mortality rate. Same idea, the number of deaths per 1,000 people in a year. And here's where it all comes together. The magic is in the difference between the two. You take the birth rate, subtract the death rate, and what you get is the survival rate. That simple piece of math, that's the engine that drives all population growth. Now, this model breaks the whole journey down into 3 stages. And you can literally see India's story right here. Okay, stage 1, that's India before 1921. You've got a high birth rate, but you also have a high death rate. They kind of cancel each other out, so population growth is pretty low. Then comes stage 2. This is the big one. Suddenly you get better healthcare, more food, so the death rate plummets. But, and this is key, the birth rate stays high. That massive gap between births and deaths, that's the population explosion. This is where India has been for decades. Finally, you get to stage 3. People start having fewer kids, so the birth rate drops to meet the low death rate, and things stabilize. This is what you see in most developed countries.
Okay, so that brings us pretty much up to today. We've had the Great Divide, the population explosion, but what's happening now? Well, the latest data is showing us another major shift is underway. Check out this chart. In the decade from 1991 to 2001, the population was still growing at an average of 1.9% a year. But then, look at the next decade, from 2001 to 2011. It dropped down to 1.4%. That's a really significant slowdown. The engine of that population explosion is finally starting to cool off.
Today, we are diving into a topic that has profoundly shaped modern India: its population. But, this isn't just a story about numbers. It's a fascinating story about economics, society, and that really delicate dance between progress and resources. All right, let's get into it.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the basic equation of population growth. Then we're going to dig into the two big pieces of that puzzle: why birth rates were so high and why death rates started to fall. From there, we'll explore what happens when those two get out of balance, and we'll wrap up by looking at the three-part strategy to tackle the whole issue.
So, first things first, what does population explosion actually mean? Well, think of it like a race. In one lane, you've got population growth, and in the other lane, you've got the economy growing and developing. A population explosion is what happens when the population is growing way, way faster than the economy can keep up.
To make this super simple, let's picture a bathtub. The country's population is the water level. The birth rate? That's the faucet pouring more water in. And the death rate is the drain letting water out. Now, for a long time in India, that faucet was cranked all the way up, while the drain got kind of clogged and slowed down. And the result? A tub that started filling up really, really fast.
Okay, so let's start with that faucet. Why was it turned on so high for so long? Well, the reasons are a really complex mix of social customs and economic realities that go back generations.
On the social front, a few things really stand out. First, lower literacy levels, especially for women, often went hand in hand with more traditional views on how big a family should be. Second, marriage wasn't just a personal choice, it was seen as a religious and social duty. And third, with the legal age of marriage being relatively low, it naturally meant there was a longer window of time for couples to have children.
And social structures themselves played a huge part. For instance, in a joint family system, the financial burden of raising children is shared among everyone, so the perceived cost of having one more child feels lower. This was often combined with a really strong cultural preference for having a son, which meant many families would continue having children until a boy was born.
And here's the thing, the economics of the time just reinforced all of this. In a country that was heavily dependent on agriculture, more kids literally meant more hands to help on the farm. And for families living in poverty, the thinking was often that more children meant more potential earners to help support everyone. You can see how all these factors just layered on top of each other.
Now let's flip over to the other side of our bathtub analogy, the drain. While the birth rate faucet was on full blast, something remarkable happened. The death rate started to fall. And this is actually a story of incredible progress. I mean, just look at these numbers for infant mortality. In 1951, a staggering 146 out of every 1,000 babies born didn't survive. By 2011, that number had dropped all the way down to 47. That single statistic tells an amazing story of huge improvements in public health in just a couple of generations.
So how did this happen? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was an all-out effort. Medical advances pretty much wiped out old epidemics like smallpox and cholera. Better healthcare meant far fewer mothers were dying in childbirth. As literacy rates went up, so did awareness about health and childcare. Programs like the midday meal tackled malnutrition, and even better disaster management helped save countless lives.
Okay, so you have a high birth rate and a falling death rate. That growing gap between the two, that's where the explosion happens. And this imbalance, as you can imagine, started to put a massive strain on the country's resources and infrastructure.
And the effects just ripple outwards. You've got more pressure on farmland to produce enough food. You have huge strain on infrastructure like housing and public transport. When food demand outstrips supply, that can drive up prices. All of this puts stress on the environment and can create social challenges, ultimately acting as a drag on the nation's per capita income.
So, faced with this enormous challenge, what do you do? Well, the strategy that developed wasn't just one simple fix. It was a really comprehensive three-part plan to tackle the problem from every possible angle.
So the approach really came in three flavors. First, economic measures designed to raise the standard of living for everyone. Second, social measures that focused on changing norms through education and empowerment. And third, a direct and evolving population policy led by the government. Let's take a quick look at each.
From an economic standpoint, the logic is pretty clear. As people become more financially secure, they tend to have smaller families. So the focus shifted to things like growing the industrial sector, creating more jobs, and attacking poverty head-on. There's a famous saying that development is the best contraceptive, and that's really the idea here.
Socially, the levers for change were just as important, if not more so. Spreading education, especially for girls, has a direct, powerful impact on family planning and health. Improving the status of women gives them more say in their own lives and futures. And of course, raising the minimum age of marriage helps shorten that fertility window while giving young people more time for education and personal growth.
And this all leads us to the official government policy, which, as you can see, has really evolved. It started back in 1952 with a pretty narrow focus on family planning. By 1979, the name changed to family welfare, a sign that the thinking had broadened to include the health of mothers and children. Then, in 2000, the National Population Policy took an even wider view, aiming not just to control the numbers, but to improve the overall quality of life for everyone.
And I think this quote really captures the modern philosophy perfectly. The point isn't about control or coercion. It's about empowerment. It's about getting to a place where having a child is a deliberate, informed choice, not something that just happens by chance. At the end of the day, all of these different efforts are pushing towards a concept called optimum population. You can think of it as a state of equilibrium, that perfect sweet spot where the population size is balanced with the country's resources and its ability to support everyone well.
Hey, welcome! Today we're tackling a massive topic. I mean, literally, population. But we're not just going to talk numbers. We're going to completely flip the script on a really common idea and look at how a nation's people, well, they might just be its greatest asset, not its biggest burden. So, you ready? Let's get into it.
So let's just jump right in with the central question, shall we? Is having a billion people a burden, or is it a blessing? For, decades now, the conversation has always seemed to lean one way, framing huge populations as this problem we have to manage. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? Okay, so to really get that shift in perspective, we have to start with the traditional view. We'll call this first part a question of numbers. So the view most of us probably grew up with is pretty simple, right? More people equals more problems. You know the drill. More mouths to feed, way more strain on our natural resources and infrastructure, more people fighting for the same jobs. It's a whole story built around scarcity and, frankly, a lot of stress. But now, let's do a hard pivot. Section 2, the ultimate resource. This is where things start to get really interesting and, honestly, a lot more optimistic.
Now check out this quote from our source material because it's everything. It is people with their demands and abilities that turn them into resources. Think about that. All the stuff in nature, minerals, forests, you name it, it's just stuff. It doesn't become a resource until a person figures out what to do with it. It's human ingenuity that literally creates value out of thin air.
And that brings us to this super important definition. When we talk about a human resource, we're not just counting heads. Nope. We're talking about the total stock of knowledge, skills, and motivation that people have inside them. So the key takeaway here is, it's not about quantity, it's all about the quality and the potential. This whole idea is wrapped up perfectly in the concept of human development, something the UN Development Program really championed back in 1990. The goal is to expand all human choices, not just making more money. We're talking social, cultural, political choices too, because according to this view, the real wealth of a nation is how rich its people's lives are. Okay, so if people are the ultimate resource, how do you, develop that resource? That's what brings us to our third section here, the human development engine. This is the million-dollar question, isn't it? What's the secret sauce? What's the actual process that takes a person's raw potential and turns it into something incredibly valuable for the entire country? And this slide just lays it out so clearly. It's a value chain. It all kicks off with investment, and we're talking about the absolute foundations: good health, proper nutrition, and solid education. You pour resources into that, and what happens? You start to see direct, measurable improvements. People live longer, more people can read. And the final payoff for all that? A way more productive population, which then becomes the engine that drives the whole economy forward. And hey, the benefits don't just stop at a better economy. I mean, look at these incredible ripple effects. A healthy, educated population means a more stable society. You see fewer civil disturbances. It encourages innovation and R&D. And here's a fascinating one. Investing in people, especially in educating women, is one of the best ways to naturally control population growth. It just creates this amazing virtuous cycle.
What's great is that this isn't some abstract theory. It boils down to a really clear to-do list for any country that wants to get serious about this. These are real, tangible goals you can aim for. Things like making sure every kid gets an education, slashing those awful infant and maternal mortality rates, and building a public health system that actually works. This is basically the blueprint for building human capital. Okay, so we've talked about the investment and the process. Now it's time to talk about the payoff. Which brings us to Section 4, reaping the dividend. We've gone through the investment, the how-to, all the wider benefits for society, but what's the big economic prize at the finish line? What is this dividend we're talking about? It's this really powerful economic concept called the demographic dividend. So what is it? Well, imagine a country's population structure shifts. Suddenly you have this huge chunk of people who are working age, way more than the number of kids and retirees they have to support. That gap, that sweet spot, that's where you get this incredible potential for explosive economic growth. Let's just boil it all down to its simplest form. It means you have more working hands and more innovative minds firing on all cylinders, contributing to the economy. And if that giant workforce is healthy, educated, and motivated because of all that investment we just talked about, that becomes a massive, massive competitive advantage for a nation on the world stage. Which brings us right back where we started to our final section and our original question. Is it a potential or is it a problem? Let's just say it one more time, because it really is the mantra of this whole explainer. Human resource is the ultimate resource. It's the thread that ties absolutely everything together, from healthcare and schools all the way to economic prosperity. So here's the big takeaway. A nation's population isn't some fixed number on a spreadsheet that's automatically a liability. Not at all. It's a dynamic, living, breathing asset. It's a wellspring of potential that's just waiting for the right investments to be unlocked.